Hello, I'm Jay Hutch. Welcome to Jay Hutch Talks Too Much. Here we are back again. As I said, my name is Jay Hutch, and I am here to help. There's a lot of great podcasts out there. A lot of them telling you a lot of important information, good information, entertaining information. But so few of them are there to help. That's where I come in. All right, so today we are going to be talking about Franz Kafka and two of his stories, a short story called The Judgment and a longer story, not quite a novel, a novella, I would say. I was saying earlier tonight, I didn't know how to really say how much I liked Metamorphosis, and I said it was one of the greatest novellas I've ever read. But the fact of the matter is I have not read that many novellas in my life. But it is a fantastic, a phenomenal story. Kafka is one of my most favorite authors, and I just thought, here's what I was thinking. When I started doing Jay Hutch Talks Too Much in the fall, and I was going to do literature, I was going in chronological order. So the first thing we did was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then we looked at Homer's work, the Iliad, the Odyssey. And then we looked at Plato's Republic, and we were really going in a kind of chronological order. But I do think that I might, I'm going to switch that up a little bit. And I like the idea of doing a series of videos on one author and kind of looking at his career as a whole. I'm not going to read everything that Kafka ever wrote, but I'm going to try and look at some heavy hitters. So, I'll still be doing the other podcasts where I talk about things that are not literature, but the ones where I do literature, I'm going to be looking at Kafka's work for the next couple. I think tonight, as I say, we'll look at the Judgment and Metamorphosis, and then on the next one, whenever that's going to be, I'll do the Trial. And my friend John got me this whole collection of Kafka books a few years ago. So thanks to him, we can get this done quite easily. Up there behind me somewhere, I have The Castle. I'll do that one. And I will do at least a few other short stories, in particular in the penal colony, maybe something like A Country Doctor, things like that. And I'm kind of working through it chronologically as best as I can. So before we begin talking about the works, the life and works of Franz Kafka, I do want to say that if you happen, hey, remember, I'm here to help. And if you happen to like the work that I'm doing, the videos that I'm putting out there for you, then you can please feel free to like the video. And you can feel free to subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet subscribed. And if you're listening to the podcast on Apple Podcast, please feel free to subscribe to the podcast. And hey, leave a review or a comment, or both. Leave a review and a comment. Yeah, that would be fantastic. So today we're talking about Kafka, and I'm going to first maybe give a little bit of info about him before I start actually talking about his work. I do want to say, maybe explain first why I really like Kafka, because one of the goals with this podcast, a major goal with this podcast, is to talk about things that may not necessarily be widely read today. Works that I still think are important, significant. It could have the consequence of enriching our lives in some ways, making us feel better about things, but they tend not to be read or experienced. And so I want to, in some ways, try to maybe gather your anticipation, grow your anticipation to read some of these works. Now, I will also say that in order to really talk about them, I kind of do blow the endings of these texts a little bit. So if you are afraid of having the endings of these stories kind of ruined for you, just be cognizant of the fact that every once in a while I will be giving a spoiler on them. But before I do, I do want to just talk about why I like this author as much as I do. Well, first, I do happen to like the themes of his work a lot. His books are in many ways about being anxious, which right away, if you are ever at all anxious about things, and I have a tendency sometimes of being a little bit anxious about things, Kafka is in some ways speaking your language. He kind of understands and articulates your world, I think, to some degree. He talks about being powerless against authority, being an outsider, being without purpose. And so I think that he kind of touches on ways of feeling that a lot of people have. The feeling where you feel like everyone else gets it but you. And I think that there's something quite relatable in that sense. And I will say it all sounds kind of, the way I'm describing it kind of sounds like Kafka was the world's first emo guy, but I don't think I would personally characterize Kafka in that way. Because it's not just about what he's talking about, it's also sort of about the way he's talking about it. And I do think, and I've talked about this when I've talked about other works on this channel, Kafka really sort of sets a mood. There is a mood in Kafka's work that are very much all of his own. And you might remember a few months ago when I had my friend Joe on and we talked about Wes Anderson and Rushmore, and we talked a lot about the personality of Wes Anderson and how, I think most great artistic work has some level of personality in it. And the fact of the matter is not everybody's going to like a work that has a great personality, because if you just think about the people that in your world, the real people that are out there, there are some people who have big personalities, distinct personalities that is very much kind of unique to them. And some people really love them because of that personality, and some people really hate them because of that personality, right? That's usually a consequence of having a distinct and unique personality. But I think there's an element of that to all great art. So really, it's hard to have an example of a great work of art where there's not at least some people out there who actively hate it. And I think that I don't actually know if that's even true of Kafka, because I've never really met too many people in my life who have said that they don't really like him. But nevertheless, it wouldn't surprise me if there were people out there who didn't, because he does have a tremendous amount of personality in his work. It's one of those things where you can kind of read a Kafka story and without knowing who wrote it. And at the end of it, if you've read a Kafka story before, you'll probably say, that was Kafka who wrote that, wasn't it? Because there's something so distinctly his. And I think that you can, you could certainly see elements of that personality in other works. I think that there have been other creative people like authors, playwrights, filmmakers who have tried to get a little bit of that Kafka personality in their work. I'm thinking of a play like Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where you have the whole play is about, these characters who are waiting around for somebody who never actually shows up. There's a spoiler alert right there. Or, you can certainly see, I think, the Kafka personality at work in David Lynch's films. I don't think a lot of Kafka's work doesn't necessarily get to be as outright horrifying as something like Eraserhead is, but there is a kind of dreamlike, occasionally veering into nightmarish quality to Kafka's work. But it doesn't quite veer so headlong into the nightmare as Lynch's films sometimes do, as certainly as Eraserhead does. But I think you can certainly see a little bit of that personality there. Or Terry Gilliam's Brazil is another example. But Brazil also, I think, almost ramps up some of the griminess that is a little bit in Kafka, but maybe even sort of more so in a movie like Brazil. But, I think certainly there's elements of Kafka in those works as well. And not to say that Kafka himself wasn't influenced by others, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But again, he has his works. I'm not saying Kafka himself had a big personality, although there are certainly some evidence to suggest that he did. But I'm mostly concerned about the personality of his works themselves. They had a significant personality, and you can see that being evoked in other people's works as well. But there is a kind of as well as the sort of nightmarish quality and the potential griminess that's there along the edges of his work, there's a lot of very unique poetic expression in his stories. Just one second here. And I've talked a little bit before about the filmmaker Ingmar Bergman, who, if you haven't seen any of Bergman's movies, I do highly recommend seeing them. There's another great artist with a lot of whose works have a lot of personality in them. And but for example, his movie The Seventh Seal, which is probably considered his best film. It's not my favorite of his personally, but I think it's a phenomenal movie. But in The Seventh Seal, one of the things that he does famously, so you're probably maybe familiar with this if you've probably seen the imagery before, that he kind of demonstrates in that movie, a person's wrestling with their own mortality in a way that's very purely poetic. Let's say he shows it as a man who is having a chess game with death, right? So with a kind of personified death. You've probably seen the image before, or at least if not that, you've seen it parodied in like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or something like that. But in some ways, Kafka is doing very much the same thing. He's finding these very unique ways of expressing an idea like that. And so, all of those things, I think, are make him a really special writer, that there's just a very unique personality in his work that you could tell, again, that it's his without knowing that it's his. And just the way that he goes about expressing these very common everyday feelings of being an outsider, of being anxious, of being powerless. But he doesn't just show those things. He expresses them in such a unique way. So if you haven't ever read any of Kafka's work, I do highly, 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 highly recommend reading his work. And in some ways, I hope maybe the discussion on these two smaller texts tonight might get you to think about reading those ones. But I'll start, actually, since I'm going to do a series of videos on Kafka. I figure with this first one, and since I'm talking about shorter texts, I have maybe a little bit of space to give you a little bit of biography about Kafka's life. I will say I was very lucky enough to get a response on Twitter from another podcast called Art of Darkness. And they recommended that I listen to their podcast on Kafka. So in some ways, I guess they're there to help as well, because they helped me. And I did listen to their podcast, their first one on Kafka. They've got two, and I started to listen to the second one. I actually was just listening to the second one, and I stopped it to come here to do this one for you guys. But it's a very informative discussion on Kafka. It does focus on his work, but it goes very much in depth into the life of Kafka, which I'm not going to go into quite that amount of depth. But I will say, if you are looking to get more of the Franz Kafka biography, I do highly recommend the Art of Darkness podcast on Kafka. It was the one that mostly focuses on his life, was done certainly a few months ago. So certainly well worth checking out. And I thank the guys over there for recommending their podcast to me. So I'll give you a little bit of his biography. Kafka is born in Prague in 1883, and he dies at the age of 40 in 1924. And that's it. Okay. No. Okay. So there is more. I'll give you a little bit more. Kafka grows up in a German-speaking Jewish family. He's the oldest of 6 children. Now, his family ends up looming quite large throughout his life. In some ways, Kafka's never really quite able to fully detach himself from his family, which isn't necessarily a bad thing with some families. But in this case, I think in particular, the hold that his father has on him was a very unhealthy one, and one that seems to seep into a lot of his works. Now, I haven't really mentioned this that much before on the podcast, but one of my so you do know, if you have watched some of them before, you know that I'm a big Beatles fan, but I'm also a big Beach Boys fan, and I spent a good amount of my certainly late teens and early 20s finding out as much as I possibly could about the about the Beach Boys. And the things that I have heard doing a little bit of research for this podcast about the relationship between Franz Kafka and his father Hermann are really quite reminiscent of the relationship and the dynamic that was at work between Brian Wilson, the leader of the Beach Boys, and his father, Murray. So the relationship between Brian and Murray was very much an abusive one. And Murray was, I remember the thing that I think really sums it up is there's a bit of footage somewhere of the other 2 brothers in the Beach Boys, not Brian, but Carl and Dennis, being interviewed. And Carl is saying, you know, I guess they've been asked about Murray, and he says he had a big personality. He burst into a room, and then Dennis says, and beat everybody up. And Dennis will not, hold back, obviously, in terms of Carl is trying to be a very diplomatic person in that moment. And Dennis is just going to say how it actually was. And that is basically the kind of relationship that I think was at work with Hermann Kafka and Franz Kafka. He was a domineering, overbearing, and abusive guy. And I do think that in many ways this affected Franz Kafka in a significant way. There was, for one, Hermann was a businessman, and there was an expectation that Franz, probably as the oldest child in the family, the oldest boy, would have had to follow in his father's footsteps. And I think that this, his whole general attitude left Kafka with this feeling throughout most of his life that he had this need to do right by his father, to appease his father, to please him, but also felt this resentment that, his father's actions have maybe turned him into a person who had trouble functioning in the world. And if you sort of follow Kafka's life, what you find is a guy who has this inability to ever entirely settle on something or feel confident about anything, or a lot of his works end up being unfinished because he just can't bring himself to complete them. And there's other reasons why that's the case too. But again, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Brian Wilson, because, Brian Wilson was a victim of this dominating, overbearing figure who dealt all the Wilson kids these sort of self-worth issues. And Brian responded to that by, wanting to be a, great musician. And that's in fact what he ended up being, and a fantastic composer. But he also ran out of steam after about 6 or 7 years, which is really quite amazing that he was able to function that long. But eventually he just couldn't keep up anymore, and got to a point where he was filled with all this self-doubt. And famously too, his great masterwork, Brian Wilson's great masterwork, was left unfinished for decades and decades. So, I think that you can sort of see a lot. At least I saw a lot of interesting parallels there between those two guys. Now, the other important aspect that people discuss with Kafka is that he would have been a target of anti-Semitism, and his cultural heritage more than likely would have left him feeling as an outsider in his community and in his school. Now, when he goes to university, he ends up becoming best friends with this guy by the name of Max Brod. Brod figures in very heavily in Kafka's short life. But like Kafka, Brod is also Jewish. He was also a German-speaking Czech. So in that sense, Kafka probably felt like he found somebody who he could maybe relate to and maybe make him feel like less of an outsider. So as I say, Brod went on to be a very important figure in Kafka's life. Ultimately, Kafka ends up publishing very little in his lifetime. The two texts that we are talking about tonight, the Judgment and Metamorphosis, are two texts that were published in Kafka's lifetime, but a lot of his great works were in fact not. The Trial, The Castle, America, all three are unpublished and left unfinished, really, in his lifetime. But Brod actually. So what happens is that Kafka contracts tuberculosis in 1917, and he dies 7 years later. At the age of 40, at that point being so affected by tuberculosis that he's unable to eat. But his sort of final last dying wish is to Max Brod to destroy all of his work, right? This is, again, very famous in the sort of Kafka mythology, the Kafka lore. And of course, what does Brod do? Well, we all know what it does because we have this text here in front of us. We know that he didn't burn the books. He ended up actually getting them published. And that's how we have so much of the great Kafka works today. So Brod ultimately becomes this significant figure in the Kafka story. So tonight I want to talk about two of his earlier pieces, The Judgment and Metamorphosis. The Judgment, as I say, is a short story. It's about 14 pages long. And I think it's good to begin with The Judgment, because it's with The Judgment where Kafka feels like he's truly created something significant, right? This was, I think, for him, the story where he really becomes a serious writer. Now, he had published several pieces before this. He had been writing since at least 1904, and he'd been publishing since 1908. But he writes The Judgment in one sitting and we know the date exactly because he was a tremendous diarist, right? He writes all his days down in the diary, everything that happened to him. So we know so much about what happened in Kafka's life because he recorded it very dutifully. But he writes The Judgment in one sitting on September 22nd, 1912. And he says in his diary, after having written it, that the work represented the total opening of body and soul. And he dedicates The Judgment to Felice Bauer, with whom he had a tumultuous relationship, was engaged to twice. He never married her. He never married at all. Was sort of heavily involved with several women in his life. Felice Bauer was maybe one of the more consistent ones. And it's kind of amusing that he does end up dedicating this story to her, considering how the story evolves. But sort of that's the background for this work. And so what I'll do is I will just quickly summarize what it is, what the text is about. So again, if you are worried about spoilers, just keep in mind that that's. But again, it's a short work. So I'm just going to take a little sip here of this delicious beverage, and then I will read you the summary of the judgment. Okay. So the judgment features a character named Jorg Bendeman. And Jorg Bendeman is a young, I just realized as I'm saying this for the first time, I love saying the word Jorg Bendeman. It's a great word to say. He is a young businessman. He's just, as we start the story, he's just written a letter to his friend who has years ago, the friend has emigrated to Russia to manage his own business. And we learn that the friend in Russia has been met with a general lack of success. And this is in comparison to Jorg Bendeman's own comparative success. He's taken over the family business in the last few years, and business has been booming. And Jorg seems to feel some amount of guilt for doing well while his friend is suffering in Russia. And for those same reasons, he's been resisting telling his friend that he is engaged to be married. But he has finally just told him in the letter that he has sent at the beginning of the story. Now, Jorg and his father live together, and they've been living together for the last 2 years since Jorg's mother died. And by the descriptions, his father seems to have become quite frail in his old age. Now, Jorg goes into the next room to see his father, and he tells him about the letter that he has just sent. Now, this sets his father off. First, the father is skeptical that his son even has a friend in Russia, though, Jorg is able to produce evidence of the fact that the father has had actual conversations with this friend in Russia. He's like, yeah, you've talked to him. You had all these conversations. But then the father launches into an attack, saying that even though he had just said that he doesn't think that this guy exists, he then says that Jorg's friend in Russia is actually more of a son to him than Jorg is, that Jorg has been stringing his friend along. He says that the only reason he got engaged was that Jorg got engaged was because his fiancée hoiked up her skirt. And because of this, he has disgraced the memory of his mother. And just here, I'm going to just say the ending here in one sentence. So maybe skip ahead 10 seconds. This whole tirade ends with the father finally saying, I sentence you to death by drowning. And Jorg leaves, goes to the bridge, says, dear parents, I have always loved you, and jumps. And that's the end of the judgment. A bit of a shocking, surprising ending, as it seems to begin in such a kind of mundane, regular way, and then it kind of goes from 0 to 100 within just a matter of pages. So obviously, lots of people have read the judgment through the prism of Kafka's biography, particularly the relationship that he had with his father, which I just talked about. Now, Kafka wrote a really long collection of letters later on in his life, and it's collected in a text called "Letters to My Father" or something along those lines, where he does basically, rant about the way that his father has treated him throughout his life, and how that has left him with all these different feelings of inadequacy and things like that. So certainly I think there is a justifiable reading of the judgment as kind of an example of the way Kafka felt about the relationship that he had with his own father. But I think that the judgment is actually, while it might be doing that it's also making a much broader statement about power and how power functions. Now, here's the thing. The ending of the story is like what so much of what happens in Kafka is like, right? It's not meant to be grounded in any particular reality. It is, of course, here I'm going to spoil the ending once again. It is, of course, absurd that his father would say, "I sentence you to death by drowning." I mean, what kind of a thing is that to say? Even in a hostile, angry, it almost seems too silly that nobody would even take that seriously, right? If somebody said, "You know what? I sentence you to death by drowning." That's something that a lot of people probably that would deflate the argument rather than, increase the hostility of it. So, that, of course, there's an absurdity to that. And of course, it's absurd that York's response is to actually do it, right? To actually just obey what his father has said. I don't think this is a moment where Kafka is saying, this is what would happen in real life. If this argument was going on, this is what would happen. But I do think he is making a statement on the nature of power relations, right? And here is, I think, a great example of Kafka's strength as a writer, in that he begins this text with Jorg finding so much pleasure in a small thing. Actually, I'll just read a bit of the first paragraph here. It was a Sunday morning at the height of spring, right? The first line of the book is very positive, right? It's very Canterbury Tales, it was a Sunday morning at the height of spring, right? Rebirth. Who would think that the text? Okay, look, I'm just going to keep spoiling it over and over again. So I have to say that you're going to have to accept that. Who would think that a text that begins with a rebirth, renaissance, a time of renaissance, of rebirth, of renewal, is going to end with death in the way that it does? It was a Sunday morning at the height of spring. Jörg Benjamin, a young businessman, was sitting in his study on the first floor of one of the low, lightly built houses that ran along the riverbank in a long row, varying only in details of height and color. He had just finished a letter to an old friend presently living abroad, and now sealed it with playful ceremony, and with his elbows propped on his desk, gazed out of the window at the river, the bridge, and the pallid green of the heights on the opposite bank, right? You can kind of see this guy, Jörg Benjamin, doing this, feeling really good, right? Sealing the letter with playful ceremony. So he's like, da, 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 something. He's very happy about what he's doing, right? And so there's a certainly this kind of this playfulness, this sort of almost joy about what he's doing, and this moment of seeming serenity and self-satisfaction as he looks out the window. And of course, what is he looking out to? But he's looking out to this bridge that in about 20 minutes time he's going to jump off of, and the river that he's going to jump into. But of course, at this moment, he's not doesn't seem to be anything that's going to be coming up anytime soon. So there's this sort of pleasant moment, but of course, Kafka is building into it a lot of information that's going to become even more significant later on in the story. And I think one of the things that Kafka is doing here with this story is he's demonstrating how quickly you can go from feeling so good to feeling so small, right? From feeling good about your life decisions so much that the guilt that you feel is actually about revealing too much of the goodness of your life to your friend, right? To feeling a little bit guilty about just how good things are going for you. Gosh, do I tell my friend about how good the business is going, about my engagement? Is it humiliating to him to try to get him to come back for the wedding? So there is this kind of sense. Yes, he's a character who does feel guilty, but we do get a lot of information about how good things are for him, right? And then it goes from that to feeling that you have to make this terrible decision about your life. And I think that the information that we get about Jorg's successes and also about his father's frailty, it tells us everything we need to know about the scene that eventually unfolds. So the father, I'm going to take another drink here before I talk about the father. Need to have a drink before the father comes into play, because the father's a real piece of work. All right. So the father is in so many ways powerless, right? He himself admits that he's unable to function at work in the way he used to be able to. So at one point, he says, at work, certain things escape my notice. They're perhaps not exactly done behind my back. I don't want to make the assumption that they were done behind my back, but I no longer have the strength, and my memory isn't what it was either. I can no longer deal with so many different things at once. And so he says this, and we also, see moments where the son is like helping the father to change his soiled underwear. He carries his father into bed. The father kind of demands to be, make sure the blankets are on nice and that they're keeping him warm. And in all respects, on the surface, it seems like the conventional parent-child roles have reversed, right? And it would take a lot of denial, I think, on both the parts of Jorg and his father not to recognize this. So I think this is what's happening in this story. Jorg's father is seeing his position as the more powerful figure in the parent-child relationship slipping away from him. He's heading towards this life of being totally dependent on his son, if he's not already there, and he seems to be almost pretty much already there, right? And moreover, his son seems to actually be up to the task of helping his father. He is doing all the things that he needs to do. Although, once again, this character is plagued with guilt, and so he's constantly thinking about how he's not doing enough for his father, but he certainly seems to be able to take care of him. He's able to carry him to bed. He's able to change his clothes and so on. But if you're a power-hungry person, if you're inherently dominating, as the father of this story is, just as, yes, Kafka's actual father was, apparently, you don't want that power dynamic where you are the authority to go away, right? You want to make sure that you still remain the powerful figure in this relationship. So that's why I think it's important that Kafka shows us that the father has all this weakness and fragility, this physical weakness and fragility, and actually even mental weakness to some degree, if what he's telling us about what's happening at work, where his memory isn't what it is either, and he can no longer deal with different things at once, if what he's saying is actually true, that he's fragile in so many ways. And I think it's significant that Kafka shows us this before the father goes on his rant, before he goes on his tirade, right? The goal of which is to try to make his son feel bad about all of his accomplishments, right? He tells him his friend in Russia isn't a real friend. He says, we pretty much make fun of you behind your back, or we mourn about you behind your back. And your engagement to this woman, which you probably feel really good about, that's a disgrace. And you're disgracing your late mother by being married to, or getting married to this woman. You're duplicitous at work, right? All of these kind of things. So all of the things that Jorg Benjamin probably feels good about, the father is taking note of and trying to make him actually feel bad about him. And that is his way of asserting his dominance and his power in this relationship, where generally speaking, he would usually be the weaker one. And here is where it once again really reminds me of the Brian Wilson, Murray Wilson relationship. If you, I've actually got it here, but I'm not going to show it on YouTube. There's actually various videos out there of this time when the Beach Boys were holding these vocal sessions for Help Me Rhonda. And Brian Wilson's father, Murray, shows up at the session, and they caught about 5 minutes of it on tape. And a lot of the audio, if you listen to it, is about, this is Murray, the father, was, he was himself a songwriter, right? You can actually find some of Murray Wilson's songs as well on YouTube, the two-step, sidestep, and songs like that. He was a songwriter, but he was really never all that successful as a songwriter. But he wanted to instill the love of, musicianship in his family and his sons. And obviously he did. And his son then goes on to be, one of the most significant songwriters and creative artists of the 1960s, right? And creates hit after hit after hit after hit, demonstrating quite clearly that at the very least, his son was much more capable of being a financially successful songwriter than Murray Wilson ever was. And that's not to say anything of the actual creative talent involved, which in my opinion, Brian was much more creatively talented than his father, but that's obviously a little bit more of a subjective opinion. But anyway, that was what was going on. Brian was at the height of his success at the time that these vocal sessions actually take place. And Murray shows up at the session, and he's basically trying to point out to Brian that he's not as great as he thinks he is. He's basically saying, you guys, you think you've got all the answers, you think you've got it all figured out, but you know what? At the end of the day, you don't know anything. You're not as talented as you think you are. You're not as big as you think you are. And that's really the message. If you listen to the audio, you've got such a big ego now. Your success has gone to your head. That's basically what he's trying to say. And what's happening in this moment, the goal is, even though you've been so successful, you still need to feel like I'm still more powerful than you are. So I'm going to try to reduce you to feeling as small as possible. And the fact of the matter is those tactics, although they are seemingly quite silly, they do seem to actually work, right? They have an actual effect. They certainly affected Brian, and I think they certainly seem to affect Jörg Bendemann. And I do think that one can look at the Judgment and see this as a story of parental abuse. But as I say, I think that it goes beyond that, because I think that it shows us the inherent abuse that is at work in almost all relationships of authority, whether it's the authority of the government and between the government over the citizen, or the authority of the employer over the employee, or of the parent and the child, right? Now, I mean, as is well known, and I'm about to say something that's kind of pretty much a truism. This has been said a lot of times, that in a democratic system, the people actually have more power than the state, right? The power is ultimately in the hands of the people. But in order to make sure that the people don't actually take the power into their own hands, they have to be made to feel inferior. They have to be made to feel, hey, I don't have the intelligence to do this on my own. I don't have the intelligence to carry this out. I don't have the ability to make a difference. If I try, I'm going to fail. They're in power because they're supposed to be. I'm powerless because I'm supposed to be. That's just the natural way of things, right? That's often actually how power can maintain itself. Now, obviously, there are plenty of times where it can maintain itself simply through brute force, and oftentimes it will probably resort to that if the other one doesn't work out in their favor. But other times, it's quite content. People in power are quite content to simply just depend on making sure that people accept their roles as inferior, even when they are actually the more powerful ones. Hence the father saying, I condemn you to death by drowning. And then Jörg actually does it, right? This is satirical in many respects, because we look at this and we say it's kind of idiotic that the father would make this demand, and it's ridiculous that Jörg should actually follow this through. But I think Kafka is saying that, yeah, it is ridiculous, but it's ridiculous anytime we sacrifice ourselves in the name of what a person in authority tells us to do, right? When we give up a little bit of our freedom in order to do what this person in authority is telling us to do. Right. And we actually do that all the time. Right. And Kafka does have this anti-authoritarian streak. Obviously, it's pervasive in all of his work. He would have been a committed socialist at one point. And in fact, he's actually potentially an anarchist, because at one point in his diary, he praises Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin was a significant anarchist in the 19th century. So, you can see that Kafka is going to be inherently against people who arbitrarily wield their authority without justification. And I think in many ways, he's showing the efforts that people go through to maintain their authority and to maintain their power. And I think this is what is at the heart of a lot of Kafka's work. And so in that respect, I think it's kind of good to begin with a work like The Judgment. So that's The Judgment. But let me move on to Metamorphosis. So Metamorphosis is one of Kafka's most famous stories. As I said, it's a novella, one of the best novellas I've ever read. It's a novella rather than a novel or a short story like The Judgment. My copy of Metamorphosis is about 60 pages long. Metamorphosis was written around the same time as The Judgment, and was published in 1915. So published about 3 years or so after The Judgment is written. Now, this one is probably, this or The Trial are the two most famous Kafka stories. This is the one that begins, many of you have heard of it before, with the main character, Gregor Samsa, waking up to discover that he's become a cockroach, or depending on the translation, an insect, a bug, a vermin, one of those kinds of things. In my version, he's described as a monstrous cockroach. And we're told immediately that this is not a dream. So we know right from the get-go that this is something that's actually really happening. We never find out the reason for this. It's just something that happens, right? And this is kind of the first example of that we're talking about, of what's frequently termed the Kafkaesque, right? So Kafka has a term that's named after him, right? And it is Kafkaesque. And Kafkaesque, and I'm pretty sure I took this from somewhere, so I don't think these are my exact words, but I don't know where I took it from, so I apologize. Kafkaesque is a word, and a word. It is a word, but it is also a weird and strange occurrence for which there is no explanation. Hence the waking up in the morning to discover that you are a giant bug. And Metamorphosis details what happens over the next couple of months of Gregor Samsa's life. And it's not good. It's not a good development. It's a good story, but what develops in Gregor's life isn't particularly good. As you can imagine, it would not be good if you had to spend your life, for the most part, as a cockroach, especially after being a human. That is a difficult transformation, I think, to go through. So he lives with, Gregor lives with his family, his parents, and his sister. And here I'm going to just explain the story again a little bit. The first thing that really concerns Gregor is his job. So he's a traveling salesman. And like Jorg in the previous story, it seems like he's been pretty successful. You would kind of think, like the way Kafka kind of gets stereotyped, that you would almost think that the characters in his story would be very down on their luck. But that's not really what we're seeing in our, well, obviously he's down on his luck because he's just turned into a cockroach. But I mean, he's not, he's obviously not thanking fate for putting him in that position. But he's, in terms of his job, he's been fairly successful. And he's the breadwinner for his entire family. He puts food on the table. He's found them at the house that they're living in, we find out at one point. And so he's thinking about, as he wakes up in the morning as a cockroach, he's thinking about his job. But he treats his condition, at least at first, before anybody sees him or knows that he's made this transformation, he treats his condition as something he might be able to work through. It's almost like waking up with a hangover, the way he's kind of dealing with it. It's like, okay, I need a few more hours. I'll go in a little bit late. I'll take the next train in. I'll be better. It's okay. So many of you, I'm sure, have experienced something like this before, but and remember, I'm here to help. But this is how he describes it in in the text. And it quickly becomes apparent that he's not going to get better. And I will say the text does a really good job of actually concealing just how much of a bug he is. Like, part of me does wonder every time I read it, like, is there any of Gregor Samsa there? Like, can we see any element of him, or is he really just a large bug? I will say it seems to me that that's pretty much what he is. Like, I don't think there are any human elements to the cockroach. He can't communicate. Anytime he tries to talk, nobody understands him. Now, there's certainly internally, he still seems to be the same guy that he was before. But just externally, he's completely a bug, right? But he has the language that he was born with going on inside of his head. He just can't express himself with it, right? He fully transforms. He feels more comfortable when he walks like a bug. I think at first he tries to walk on his hind legs, but it's too painful, so he has to like get down on the ground, ends up sort of climbing the walls and things like that. He can't eat normal food anymore, so at one point his sister brings him in this sort of sweetened milk with bread in it, which I guess is like his when it's oddly enough, the sweetened milk with bread in it is his favorite meal when he's not a bug. When he's in his normal state, that is his favorite thing to eat. But he tries to eat it and he's repulsed by it, and he finds that the thing that kind of really he really enjoys is like rotten food, and the fresher the food is, the worse it is for him. So, and he's secreting this brown ooze. He's not a good date anymore at this point, I think we can say. But the first thing that happens is that so after this ordeal of him waking up and finding that he's a bug, is that the chief clerk from his company shows up because Gregor is now late for work. And the chief clerk shows up, and it's at this point where everybody now finally sees that he is a cockroach, and everybody is horrified. The chief clerk runs out, and the family, though, is kind of sympathetic, although his father, once again, a kind of overbearing, abusive figure, he, in this first moment, kicks him back into his room. But his sister does seem at first to be especially sympathetic. As I said, she leaves him at first this bowl of milk with the bread in it. And when she sees that he doesn't like it, she brings in like this collection of food to see what he is going to eat. And eventually he chooses one. So she knows, okay, he likes this, so I'll bring him in more rotten stuff. Forget the milk. I'll give him the rotten food. And so she seems to be maybe the most sympathetic. And the family does seem to be, sad at what has happened to some degree. And the mother can't really bring herself to look at him. They kind of keep her from looking at him. But they also all seem to be kind of a little bit resigned to his condition as well. Like they're never, as you would expect, constantly saying, God, it's weird that he's turned into a bug. Can we just talk for a minute about how he was a human being yesterday and today he's a bug? Like, can we just take a moment to discuss this? That never really happens. They don't have moments like that. So they're resigned to it. But as the text goes on, the feeling seems to be that Gregor is becoming more and more of an imposition. At one point, Gregor's mother sees him. She faints. And the father comes home and he finds out what happened. And he just flies into this rage and he takes up all these apples. Which I will say, in my head, because I had read this years ago, the last time I read it, in my head, whenever I imagine the scene, because sometimes I play it out in my head, I don't know why, but in my head, it's always green apples that he's throwing at Gregor, but in fact, it's red apples that he's throwing. So if you want a little bit of trivia, the color of apples that he's throwing at Gregor are red apples, and one of them wounds Gregor's back and kind of seems to lodge there because it mentions that nobody removes the apple, that it's just stuck there for a month. So This happens, and then of course the family needs to make money, right? Gregor was the breadwinner of the family, so they all end up getting jobs, and they bring in also these tenants, so that they can sort of rent out some of the rooms in the house, and they keep Gregor a secret because we actually learn that they're all very proper, and they like everything to be in order. But one night they do see Gregor, and they get all upset about this, of course, that they've been living in a space with this giant vermin, and they say that they're not going to pay a cent in rent, that they may even end up bringing legal proceedings against Mr. Samsa. So, that episode is obviously a significant moment that occurs. And it's at this point where the sister, the one who's been the most sympathetic so far, she's the one who eventually says, we have to do something about Gregor. We have to basically get rid of him, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to survive. And this is Gregor's last night on Earth. Wait, spoiler alert. This is he dies that night, and then the story goes on for a few more pages. Right, the family's quite sad actually about what has happened. Right, you don't actually, at least at first, they are not like, oh, thank God, finally. That's not their reaction. And again, I think that that's a lesser writer might have made that the reaction, but that's not what Kafka does. He, in fact, has them kind of sit together as a family and mourn. But then they decide to go out. And the text describes how it's really the first time they're going out in this way for months. And you get the feeling that they haven't really had an excursion since Gregor had his metamorphosis. Just the very last bit of the story tells us about how Mr. and Mrs. Samsa on this trip have noticed that their daughter has, quote, bloomed into an attractive and well-built girl. And so that's essentially how the story ends. So why do I think that Metamorphosis is an interesting story? Well, again, right from the beginning, it's an extremely interesting premise, but it's more than just an interesting premise. And, as I said, there's lots of choices that Kafka could have made that I think would have been very obvious choices. And I don't think he necessarily makes those choices. And I like how I really would not describe this text, and maybe others would. So, you can tell me in either in the chat, or you can tell me in the comment section. I wouldn't characterize Metamorphosis as being like speculative fiction or science fiction, even though something so otherworldly happens in the story. It just seems too... he writes about it in a way that just seems so ordinary, right? Like I said, there's never a moment in this text where they're like, God, that's strange that he turned into a bug, right? They don't have that moment in this story, really. They just kind of go on about their lives, and they try to deal with it as best as they can. And there is something that is, there's something so engaging about the fact that he's mixing the mundane with the fantastic in this way, because ultimately it's really a story about a traveling salesman living with his family. They're struggling to make ends meet, and there are these very human relationships, right? And even after he turns into the cockroach, there's the sister putting out the milk, there's the family that are still struggling to survive, there's family squabbles, all this kind of stuff, right? It's hard to see it as being anything like a fantasy or a speculative fiction, or some have called it a horror, but I don't even think it reaches that level. I think that it's a pretty kind of evenly keeled story with something extraordinarily bizarre happening in it, right? So there's just so many interesting choices that he makes, but and then on top of that, I think obviously when you have something that is as odd and as seemingly symbolic as a character who turns into a cockroach, it's going to invite a lot of analysis, right? I'm sure there's a lot of people who have looked at Metamorphosis and have said, what does this mean? What does it mean to have him turn into this into this cockroach? What's Kafka trying to say? Actually, as I was saying in the podcast that I was listening to before, the one that gave a good sense of the biography, Art of Darkness, the more recent one was making a case that Kafka is quite different from the early from the sort of 19th century Russian writers. Let me actually preface this by saying that I think that Kafka is very much inspired and influenced by those Russian writers. So just as I always said before, that you have somebody like Samuel Beckett and like David Lynch and things like that influenced by Kafka. I think Kafka is very much influenced by like Gogol's short stories, which often have these sort of fantastic elements in it as well, but are mixing with the mundane. As that podcast brought up actually as well, they mentioned The Nose, which is a story that I'll probably do on here at some point, where I'm pretty sure it's like a man has just become a giant nose, which is, you can right there see the sort of lineage from The Nose to the Metamorphosis. Yeah, I'm just actually looking up The Nose right now. Yeah. So, oh no, sorry. So it's the story of a St. Petersburg official whose nose leaves his face and develops a life of its own. So you can see right there. I'm looking at the Wikipedia article on it there, by the way. So take that for what it's worth. But that's The Nose. You can see how you have a sort of a direct relationship, a lineage between Gogol's The Nose and Metamorphosis. But you also, I think, certainly see stuff like Dostoevsky and Notes from Underground. But as the podcast I was listening to pointed out, a lot of works like Dostoevsky's will have a sort of moral to it, in the sense that you kind of get an idea at the end of these novels, like what your takeaway is supposed to be, right? So there's with Dostoevsky, there's frequently an element of like suffering. You have to suffer as a way to kind of reach sort of enlightenment and to gain sort of true forgiveness and things like that. So that's an element at work in Dostoevsky's novels, but that element is frequently, as this podcast pointed out, is frequently missing from Kafka's work. It leaves it pretty much entirely in our own hands to kind of decide what's going on. So we don't really know. As I said, we don't even really know what this cockroach is supposed to look like. And that's, again, part of the reason why, depending on the translation that you're looking at, it's either just a regular bug or a cockroach or a vermin or an insect. You get all these various different translations, and what it is named as at the beginning of your translation is probably going to, in some ways, alter your reading of the text. But again, that's a big strength of Kafka, is that he gives us a lot. He gives us a lot of information, but he withholds enough to get our imaginations really active. And I should say that it's not that I think that Dostoevsky doesn't do that, because I think there's so much going on in a Dostoevsky novel that really provokes a great amount of conversation and discussion and debate. And we'll find that out, I think, when we eventually do get to Dostoevsky, and I hope that we do at some point. And I think that certainly like I said, Kafka is very much inspired by that writing. But also, in terms of what Kafka leaves out, is also extraordinarily engaging, and it engages us to kind of figure out, okay, what's going on, and we're left with very little answers in that respect. So we kind of have to formulate our own thoughts in terms of what it is. So I will share with you now what I think is going on in the Metamorphosis, or at least why I think it engages me, or what it engages me to think about. It's by no means the only way to think about what's happening in Metamorphosis, but this is the one that works for me. So as I say at the beginning of Metamorphosis, We find out that Gregor is the breadwinner of the family. He provides for them whatever sort of security and structure and food that they have, their sort of material existence. And we also learn that the work that he does in order to provide his family these things is not particularly that great. And so here's a direct quote where Gregor is talking about his work. By this time, he's already turned into the cockroach, but he's still kind of thinking that he's going to make his way into work. And this is what he says. He says, "Oh, my Lord, if only I didn't have to follow such an exhausting profession. On the road, day in, day out, the work is so much more strenuous than it would be in head office. And then there's the additional ordeal of traveling, worries about train connection, the irregular bad meals, new people all the time, no continuity, no affection." Once again, it's hard to characterize this as like science fiction or speculative fiction, since what he's talking about is really the existence of so many people out there, which also actually makes me think sometimes that there's a connection between Kafka and the Twilight Zone, because you see a lot of Twilight Zone episodes that are set in these sort of very sort of real worlds, but there's something a little bit off about them, right? Like it's a normal family, they're on a farm or whatever, but the boy has these powers that can send you out into the cornfields for the rest of your life, or turn you into a jack-in-the-box or something like that. But everything else is normal. Every single other thing is not only normal, but it's like extra normal. It's like a regular, normal family environment, except for this one boy with these special powers, right? So there's I see a kind of influence in some of those episodes as well, but that's his description of the work that he has to do, right? This kind of drudgery that he has to do, as he says, day in, day out. And we also see, again, just to kind of as a bit of a callback to what I was talking about with the judgment, the sort of tyrannical hold that the workplace holds over Gregor, because the one day he's a few hours late, he misses the first train, and the head clerk stops by to see, hey, what's the holdup? What's going on? That is definitely, I think, a case of the tyranny of the workplace, and that not only do you not get a say in what happens in your workplace, but that they have extended themselves. They've extended their powers beyond the actual workplace into your own home to kind of see, okay, what's happening? Why didn't you make the train this morning? That's real tyranny right there, right? But I think that why does Gregor do this work if it's so terrible? Well, we find out that he does it largely because he feels this responsibility to his family, who also apparently owe money. So he says at one point, if I didn't have to exercise restraint for the sake of my parents, then I would have quit a long time ago. I would have gone up to the director and told him exactly what I thought of him. He would have fallen off his desk in surprise. That's a peculiar way he has of sitting anyway, up on his desk. That's again, like a great little aside, right? That sentence doesn't have to be in there, but it's a great sort of personal moment where he doesn't just let it rest sitting there up on his desk. And by the way, why is he on his desk? Another sort of just a great little bit of Kafka's personality coming through. And he goes on further to say, talking down to his staff from up on high, making them step up to him very close because he's so hard of hearing. Anyways, he's saying, I would, if it weren't for my parents, I would have quit and told them what I thought. And he says, well, I haven't given up hope. Once I've got the money together to pay back what my parents owe him, it may take me another 5 or 6 years. Then I'll do it. No question. Then we'll have the parting of the ways. So this is a character who seems to be actually constantly repressing these elements of his actual self. Like, it seems like every day Gregor wants to go into work and just cannot stand. Well, except he doesn't go into work. He's a traveling salesman. But when he is there, he can't stand this environment. He has such contempt for his workplace and for his boss, who sits on top of his desk and forces people to come up to him to speak very closely to his face because he claims to be hard of hearing. And, he's just constantly hating every second of this. And he's doing everything in his power to not just tell his boss exactly what he thinks of him and what he thinks of this working situation, right? He's constantly just pushing that element of himself down, right? And it's specifically, if we accept what he's saying, just to keep his family afloat, right? If I didn't have to exercise restraint for the sake of my parents, is what he says in this moment, right? And we could do like a psychological reading of this. And Kafka, we do know, was interested in Freudian psychology. He made references to Freud in his diary. But I think that what's quite interesting here is that there's this feeling that once Gregor turns into a cockroach, right, then at that point he must be gotten rid of, because he's just no longer useful, right? Mostly that he can't work and he can't make money, and that his very existence could actually prevent his family from making more money, right? His existence is the reason why the tenants end up going away. And I think that to a large degree, Kafka is showing us the perception, the way that the public perceives a person who isn't productive in an industry-oriented society, right? Gregor was important and valuable and worth keeping around. Nobody ever thought about getting rid of him when he was committing himself day in and day out to the drudgery of work, right? When he was giving himself like ulcers from the constant need to repress his anger about his workplace. When he was doing that, everything's fine. He's important. He's good. We'll keep you. But as soon as he's no longer able to do that, right, he becomes a liability even to his own family, right? This is a guy who no longer plays the game. And in this case, he can't, right? It's because he can't play the game anymore, right? But, it could also just be a guy who decides that he's no longer going to play the game anymore. And as a result, he's now an embarrassment. He's a problem to be solved. And the solution to find some way the solution to solve that problem is to get rid of him. Right. And it's regrettable and it's sad when he dies. The family are sad. But I think that's the attitude, right? Yes, it's sad. We're very sad. We're going to mourn together. But you know what? It had to happen because he was an embarrassment. He was a problem, and we just had to get rid of him. And I think that we can kind of see the metamorphosis into a cockroach as a metaphor for lots of things, right? It could be a metaphor for disability, for old age, for mental illness, or for just about anyone who's unwilling to play the game, right? And I'm using this phrase, play the game. It's a slightly borrowed from, I'm thinking of Albert Camus when he's talking about his central character and protagonist in his book, The Outsider. The Outsider, in many ways, The Outsider as a title is kind of exactly what you would sort of expect from a potentially Kafka-esque book. And I'm not necessarily saying The Outsider is Kafka-esque, but that title certainly sounds Kafka-esque. And I see some parallels here, because here's Camus' description of the central character in The Outsider. His name is Meursault. And he says, Meursault doesn't play the game. He refuses to lie. He says what he is. He refuses to hide his feelings. And so society immediately feels threatened, right? Now, this is actually not Gregor necessarily, right? Because Gregor already tells us he does have these feelings, but he's keeping them to himself, but it's for his mother and his father, right? But I do think that, the cockroach is really what could have happened if he did express himself the way he wanted to express himself, right? And the cockroach does represent all of these things, right? The cockroach is the person who is a liability in the march towards more and more progress, right? If you are not being this tool in society, if you're not the right cog in the wheel, you are just getting in the way, right? And that could be so many people, and I think in some ways that is exactly what the cockroach is in Metamorphosis. Now, you might say, well, if that's true, then why aren't all the Samses cockroaches at the beginning of the story? Because at first, at least, none of them seem to be working, right? They're all mooching off of Gregor. But I think the part of the reason why is because Gregor is not the narrator of the story, but he's the focal point of the story, and we are kind of seeing a lot of things from Gregor's perspective, right? An excellent case in point is that we can understand Gregor, and nobody else can, right? So, so we're not entirely seeing the world through Gregor's eyes, but he's definitely the focal point of the story. And the fact of the matter is that we don't see the Samsa family as cockroaches, even though they are not productive members of society at first, because Gregor doesn't see people in this way, right? He doesn't, his understanding of people is not, if you're not a productive person, you're worthless, right? And in fact, several times he points out in his cockroach form that he loves it when his sister plays the violin. And we find out that he's partly saving up money so that he can send her to violin school. And he's worried about what his parents will actually think about this. But he is a character who is actually transfixed by her self-expression, right? He doesn't see her as like a productive person. He sees her as a person with a lot of creative possibilities. And at the end of the story, in fact, the reason why the tenants end up seeing him as the cockroach is because they ask her to play the violin, and she brings the violin out and she starts playing it. And we get there's a bit of information where we find out that almost immediately the tenants become uninterested in her violin playing. But Gregor's obviously very, very interested in her playing. And he goes out to see her because he's trying to be supportive. And in that moment, that's when the tenants actually see him. So I think that they're not cockroaches, because Gregor doesn't see people as being merely tools to advance industrial society. He sees them as human beings. And so they are human beings, right? Whereas, the rest of the world, sees unproductive people as vermin, right? As essentially useless. So again, he's not telling the story, but we are largely seeing the story unfold from his point of view. And that's why I think we see that discrepancy there. Now, of course, after he dies, just to put a little postscript on this, we find out that, of course, his sister is not going to go to violin school. We don't really know if she ever really wanted to go to violin school. That was kind of Gregor's dream for her. And that's maybe worth thinking about. But she never does go to violin school in the end. We find out that, when her parents look at her and see what an adult she has become. And it is true that in Gregor's absence, she is the one who really first ends up being the one who takes up all the slack. She does all the work to take care of Gregor. She gets a job. They all get a job, but she does that in addition to everything else, right? The parents end up looking at her at the end of the story and the text says, they thought it was about time to find a suitable husband for her. So I think the idea is that, she's probably going to end up just playing the game too. And I don't think that this is a case, where Kafka is saying, this is the inevitable thing that happens, that she's going to end up getting married. That would be enough on its own. But the fact that it has come after an entire story about she's this beautiful violin player and he wanted to send her to violin school, and obviously that's not going to happen. The fact that you now find out here that they thought it was about time to find a suitable husband for her, and that this would be a confirmation, this is a quote again, of their new dreams and their fond intentions. So I think, she's probably going to end up playing the game too. And she's going to end up fulfilling the role that for a woman was supposed to play at that particular time, just as Gregor was supposed to fulfill the role of a kind of dutiful cog in a wheel or a dutiful tool for industrial progress. Whether she decides to accept that or whether she decides to reject it and potentially face the consequences of being seen as a cockroach too, is not a story that is told in the text. But that's my kind of thinking of what's going on in the story. Like I say, it's by no means the only way of reading Cockroach. I think there's lots of different ways to look at it, lots of prisms through which to view what's happening. But I do think it's one of the most uniquely written and told stories that I've ever read, and one of the examples of what makes Kafka such a engaging reader for me. So I do hope in some ways that maybe that this has encouraged you to have a look at some of his work. The next one I'm going to do, like I say, is going to be the trial. So this is the next text. By the way, I don't know if I've always interpreted this photo. Oh, I realize there's some people who can't see this because they're listening to it. But nevertheless, I'm showing the book jacket right now. I've always interpreted this to be like a visual representation of a rock and a hard place, between a rock and a hard place. But that doesn't actually look that hard. I mean, that looks like the rock. That can't be the rock. But it also doesn't look like much of a hard place. So maybe that's not actually what it means. But if it doesn't mean that, what the hell does it mean? Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up to you. So anybody who's watching this video would like to take a guess at what this actually means, let me know. I think it's rock in a hard place, except the hard place is more like a squishy sponge. But between a rock and a squishy sponge doesn't have quite the same ring to it. But anyway, that's those are my thoughts tonight on Kafka. But like I said, this is the beginning of a couple of videos on Kafka. I don't know if the next one I put up is going to be on him or not. Maybe, but maybe not. So be on the lookout for future Kafka videos whenever they might be. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching this tonight. And I will see you in the next one. So like I say, if you like the video, please like it. If you like the channel, please subscribe. Please feel free to give a review. And we'll see you in the next one. All the best. Take care. Stay healthy. Bye-bye.